Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is co-host Johan Oberg. Johan, what's going on this week?
All good, Chris. Another busy but constructive week, and looking forward to another episode. How you been?
I've been doing really well. We just had a user group meeting in my company during the day, so I had energy traders from all across Europe in my office for the last few days, so that's been kind of fun to find out what's going on. Interestingly enough, the impact of this Ukrainian-Russian war with Ukraine, what that's having on the markets, since we do a lot in energy trading in my day job, a lot of folks that I deal with do gas trading, and the volumes down and what they're doing to respond to what the long-term prognosis is are interesting things. It's interesting times.
No, for sure. That whole energy transition is extremely interesting, and I think it's on steroids, especially the last couple of months as well, which is really, really interesting. Also interesting, I think we should mention before we jumping into the pure topic of today and introducing the guest is that we're on the road a little bit as well with Insider's Guide of Energy. That's also something that changed after the COVID, that we're out and about.
Yeah, we're out and about. We're back to live events. I'm hosting a panel. Hitachi is having me come out to DistroTech in Dallas, Texas in May. So I'll be hosting a panel on EVs and the fleet impact to the grid. So that ought to be pretty interesting. But yeah, we've been out kind of common, and it's fantastic to see our audience again and not just have to talk through direct message and chat.
Perfect. I love this. Love this. What about today then? What do you think about today?
I think it's going to be interesting to get a different perspective. I spend most of my time either focused on Europe or North America. That's kind of what my day job does. And in fact, on the podcast, we spend a good bit of time. I'd say we weight more to Europe and North America. And so I'm looking for a little bit different perspective on things and see what's happening in other parts of the world, because, the energy transition isn't happening in isolation. It should be happening globally if we're successful.
No, I agree. And I also think that what I'm looking forward to discussing is also what are changes? Are there big differences between our regions? What are the recent activities in Europe affecting the global market? But also something that I read was posted by our guest in terms of where investments are going, especially for our more traditional companies, and if that is matching renewable investments. But we'll see where it goes as always. But before that, maybe we should then introduce the guest of the show. So welcome, Assaad Razzouk, CEO of Gurin Energy.
Thank you. Good to be here, Johan and Chris.
Great to have you on. As we usually say on the beginning of the show, we have an advantage. We know who you are. We've done some research on this, but our guests might not. So maybe a quick introduction. Who are you and what are your expertise?
Well, during the day, I run a renewable energy business headquartered in Singapore with a pan-Asian mandate, developing solar, wind and battery storage assets across the region. In the evening, I'm the host of the Angry Clean Energy Guy podcast, and I do what I can on social media to raise awareness and also sound the alarm about the state of our climate in general.
So how does that work in terms of, we discussed a little bit about this energy transition, and it is sometimes it's a buzzword. We're talking about it's actually happening. From your expertise, not the angry guy, maybe the happy guy today. What are the good things? Where are we?
In Asia, you mean, right?
In Asia, if you want to start, I think that's going to be interesting. But I also would like to see the differences. Are we seeing differences between markets? Are we growing faster somewhere else? Is adoption bigger somewhere else? But what do you see as kind of the main trends before we break it down into detail?
Look, first of all, I mean, I think we need to be blunt. The energy transition is nowhere, pretty much.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that renewable energy deployment needs to be somewhere between 3 to 7 times faster globally than it is today in order to bend the emission curve and in order to preserve a chance not so much to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, because I think that's been banked, but to limit warming to 2 degrees.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important to cut through a lot of the noise by actually diagnosing the fact that the energy transition is just simply not where it should be. And frankly, recently, you would have thought that the Ukraine war would have woken up the West in particular to the fact that dependency on imported coal, oil, or gas is not good, and to the fact that solar and wind give you energy independence at a cheaper cost. But what amazes me is how the rhetoric, so for example, Germany committing to go 100% renewables by 2035, clashes with the reality of what they're doing, which is approving LNG terminals, approving floating LNG terminals, together with the French and the Italians, then the Greeks announcing more LNG terminals. And you're talking billions, tens of billions of dollars of investment, which is diverting from what we should be doing.
So I guess to me, I mean, that's why it's a transition though. So I understand that it's not fast enough, that anything isn't fast enough. But I think the argument to counter that would be LNG is better than coal and oil. And the reason that the terminals would be important is you're going to need to get gas somewhere during this transition time, right? I don't think that even Germany, who seems to have a fair amount of wind and solar, anywhere ready to meet the demand. And if everything's electrified, they're still a long way from that demand, are they not?
Look, Chris, I profoundly disagree.
Okay.
On multiple accounts. Yeah, I don't even know where to start. First of all, gas is dirtier than coal, quite a bit dirtier. And the information about it has been hidden. I mean, gas leaks at every point. It leaks when you extract it. Then you have to account for the flaring which is going on. I mean, the flaring alone, if captured or stopped, would generate all the gas that Western Europe needs, according to a World Bank report, which was just out, okay. And on which I had a Twitter thread. Then natural gas leaks when you process it. Then it leaks again when you transport it. The LNG cargoes leak gas every step of the way. Then it leaks again when it gets to the other side. And then it leaks again in my house at the end of that route. And it kills people. And so this mantra that gas is cleaner than coal is just false. But the frustrating thing is, it's like the world doesn't even know anymore what to say, because all the data is there. Yet it just keeps being repeated, and we are being drowned by noise from far more financially endowed organizations. So when all of the big oil companies start shouting that gas is cleaner than coal, clearly they're spending $200 million a year on this type of messaging, and it's drowning the rest of us who are trying to actually point to the facts. which is why I said I don't even know where to start. And then second, no, we can stop using gas now. Yes, there will be sacrifices, but since when, have you been able to make radical change without any sacrifice whatsoever? I mean, people seem to, governments seem to want their cake and to eat it too, which is where this dichotomy is coming from, and it's just a false choice, because the big picture is that we are going to fry, right? So you've got climate change in the background, and somehow this apparently can be just put on ice for a decade until Madame Germany and Madame France are, ready to wean themselves off Russian gas. That's just not the correct approach to the problem.
So you say that coal is cleaner. So is that an incremental step, or being the angry clean guy? Is there no incremental step? Is it the world's going to just the clock is running out and there's no time to do that? We're already past a tipping point, perhaps, based on your changing your degrees from 1.5 to 2. So where are we? How do we get from point A to point B? I mean, when we can't even agree globally on half of things, we had a pandemic we couldn't even agree on vaccinations on. So your mandate's a pretty big order to fill.
I agree with you, Chris. It is a very big order to fill. It needs strong will from the people. You have to start by informing the people. And therefore, this goes back to my previous point. All this messaging from governments is confusing. There is an IPCC report which came out in April. I mean, it's as if nobody's read it, right? There's the IEA now, the International Energy Agency, literally shouting from the roofs after, spending a decade in denial. But they've, now forcefully turned the corner, and they are literally screaming from the rooftops. Climate scientists are screaming from the rooftops. There are several protest movements around the world also screaming from the rooftops. So your question, I don't know how to answer your question, but it's time perhaps for direct citizen climate action, because it's not like we don't have an emergency on our hands. We have an emergency on our hands, and it's called the climate emergency.
So, out of curiosity then, why are we in this situation? Because as you mentioned, we talked about shifting the energy. We read about it on a daily basis, coming out, of course, from the larger corporations, but also from politicians and other stakeholders, that gas is a transition part, as is nuclear. And on the other side, we have climate experts saying that this is not the case. Why are we in this situation? Is it purely economic, or what is it?
Yeah, that's a big question. But let's maybe just talk about nuclear for a minute. To me, there is nothing wrong with nuclear. Okay, so nuclear is clean. Now, it's got issues, which we don't need to discuss on this podcast. They're well documented, but fundamentally, it seems to work, and it does deliver clean energy. However, for whatever reason, right, the nuclear infrastructure today in Western Europe in particular isn't enough to step into the gas void, because you can't just restart a nuclear power plant when you want. And the investment in that sector has not been consistent, or really much material at all, for something like 20 years, right? So that is probably part of the problem, but it doesn't mean that you go and you say, oh, I'm going to go all into nuclear, because it's going to take you 15 years to permit a nuclear power plant, and we don't have time for 15 years. There is an obvious solution. It's onshore wind, utility scale solar, rooftop solar, building codes, and offshore wind, plus electrification, obviously. And in essence, every dollar which is diverted from that is wasting time and resources. And probably as importantly, it's misleading citizens into thinking that action is being taken when in fact it's not being taken. I mean, that's my kind of central point on this issue. And by the way, everybody's guilty. There isn't really a single government around the world which is today not still subsidizing fossil fuels in one form or another, right? So it's not like this is, you know, this country's fault or that country's fault. It's everybody's fault.
So you're pretty pessimistic of where we are today, saying we haven't done anything towards the transition, right? But without where we are today, we wouldn't even have some of the technologies and the cost points to offer offshore wind. We wouldn't have, the solar kind of capacity that we have and the amount going in. So I don't know that we're really nowhere. We're probably nowhere near where you think we need to be, but I don't think we're nowhere, right? I mean, I think storage, grid scale storage is still going to be a problem for us. I think that's not conquered yet. I think it's still a work in progress. And there's a whole lot of battery tech getting built, and I'm sure there's going to be side effect from having all the batteries that we're looking to build. But I can't imagine. I hear you sighing and getting frustrated with me, but I don't think we're nowhere. Is my point? I think we're just probably not where we would want to be. Is that not accurate, or you totally disagree with that?
That's completely accurate. I didn't say we haven't done anything. I just said the energy transition is nowhere in terms of a continuum of where it needs to be to bend the emission curve, right? Obviously, it is somewhere. And the tools are all staring us in the face. And I'm going to give you an example, from the field, so to speak. Just to switch to Asia for a second. So Singapore is 95% powered by natural gas. So 95% of its electricity comes from natural gas. It's a small country which perhaps doesn't have the land that it needs to scale up solar resources and doesn't have enough wind resources to actually build any offshore wind. Natural gas, however, is somewhat out of control in the sense that if you depend on it, the price is multiplied anywhere from 2 times to 10 times, depending on where you are on the buying curve. And so electricity prices, household energy prices, and industrial electricity prices have all gone up by multiples of what they were a year ago. Singapore reacted in October 2021 by putting out a tender to import 30% of its electricity in the form of renewable energy. Why import? Because you're going to have to build solar or wind in a neighboring country and then bring it either via a grid or a subsea cable. Singapore, however, to go back to your battery point, asked for a 75% capacity factor. And this is a public document, right? Which is accessible by anybody. And a 75 capacity factor means that they asked for far more than solar or wind would deliver currently without any battery storage. And to my knowledge, far more than what anyone has asked anywhere in the world. Right? It's not usual for municipalities, cities, regions, or countries to put out a tender and say, I want a 75% capacity factor. Now, guess what the result was? And again, this is public information. They received 20 bids from 20 different consortiums, all of which are promising to deliver 75% capacity factor or more. So, in fact, we don't have a battery storage problem. We don't have an engineering problem. We don't have a technology problem.
So, but that doesn't solve. So that covers a point that I made, but it doesn't solve, I think, one of the opening points that we had. Maybe it was pre-show and we hadn't gone live yet, where you said energy security, I think, was something that was more prevalent in that that's inconsistent to me with the Russian war on Ukraine causing countries to pay attention to energy security, because now we have a country importing energy yet again. So that one data point, and I'm just trying to ferret it, just to be contrarian, to say that was inconsistent with the point that you made earlier, right?
Well, no, actually, I don't think so, Chris, because they're already importing natural gas, aren't they? Right? So
So it doesn't solve the problem either way for them, for
it
energy
doesn't
security.
solve the yes, but a country like Singapore will always have an energy security problem. I mean, until such time as nuclear fission maybe comes through. Nuclear fusion, sorry, comes through, right? And you can build a small reactor and get 100% unlimited energy, which is clean.
Cool.
So, I mean, it depends on which country we're talking about, but some countries will, by definition, have an energy security problem because they're not endowed with enough resources to scale up wind and solar and batteries.
Interesting.
So when we talk about geographies, we're talking about countries and their approach. We have the energy security, which is obviously a big topic, especially here in Europe. But with your expertise also on APAC, we haven't had so much guests coming from that part of the world, and it's very interesting to hear the Singapore example of this transition, and they solved it in one way or the other. But how do you see the kind of the Asia growth? Because we get a lot of, I wouldn't say bad publicity, but the coal is growing, and all kind of the, I wouldn't say the bad news, but the negative news at least. How do you see the renewable trends? Obviously, it's a big region, but can you summarize it? Where are they going? Where are you going?
Yeah, let me give that a shot. Asia is a very big place. So I think let's start by dividing it into maybe three pieces. Piece one is China and India. China and India are, by population, obviously the largest countries. They're economic powers, both of them. And I would say by and large that China and India are doing just as much as anybody else in the world on renewable energy in particular. And in the case of China, China is probably doing the most in the world on renewable energy, electric cars, manufacturing of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, etc. So China and India, which have specific challenges to them, it's difficult to fault them on this topic because they're ahead of the Americans, for example, or the West Europeans in many areas to do with renewable energy. Now, then you've got rich Asia, so category 2. So that would be Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, so OECD Asia, even though Taiwan is not OECD, but let's just call it that for a second. And there, I think the situation is unsatisfactory, right? So they are laggards compared to China, India, Western Europe, or the United States. And they need to do a lot more, but they've started. So Japan and South Korea both legislated net zero by 2050. And all 4 countries are scaling up, but literally now, right? As opposed to, say, 10 years ago. I mean, there are exceptions and there are subtleties, but so I'm generalizing, so by definition, we're going to stay general. Then the third area is emerging Asia. So that's mostly the ASEAN region, right? So that's Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, Cambodia, Laos, and a couple of other countries. Can also do much better and is also a laggard, but has its own specific challenges. So it's a mixed picture in Asia. I mean, the way it is in Europe, if you look at all of Europe. And more can be done, without exception, everywhere, in the same way that more can be done in North America, much, much more, and more can be done in Western Europe. But I would rank Asia as, not scandalous compared to, say, I don't know, Canada, for example, far wealthier country with far more territory, which is, really not pulling its weight in terms of the energy transition.
So when you look at that for Asia, what is driving? If we pick one of the regions, if we take Singapore, which is your home market kind of way, what is driving this? We talked. Well, you mentioned in the beginning a little bit about we need to change the behavior and we need to put pressure as customers, consumers around this. But if you look at this transition, they're doing good. They probably didn't do a few years ago, as you mentioned. But what drives it?
Well, that's an interesting question, actually, Johan, because the answer obviously usually is bottom up, but as a general observation, every country other than Indonesia is a net energy importer. So they all are dependent on shipments of coal, oil, and gas, right? So that's, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, all of them, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, all of them. And so clearly, the last 2 years, volatility plus energy security, plus the fact that renewable energy is just now blindingly cheaper, is shaking the tree.
So I guess, to me, it sounds like, you said, there's some countries that you don't think are pulling their weight. There's the economics driving it, which I have found to be the most powerful tool, at least, if it's for solar or renewables, because when it makes economic sense, the people's will changes very quickly, or at least corporate will does, and they start investing in renewables and things because it affects the bottom line. How do you see change coming? How do you think? People have been screaming from the rooftops. I don't think your message is a new message. I think there's some that begrudgingly now agree that maybe didn't agree in the past that there could be a problem. But so how do you accelerate this? How does that work? There's trillions of dollars of investment lined up. There's trillions short to hit the goal. There's not enough investment being put in place globally to make a full transition. How do we change that?
We know what needs to be done, right? The problem is that it's not getting done. So we are subsidizing fossil fuels. We're not subsidizing really the clean energy space, nor does it need subsidies because it's competitive. But nonetheless, it's competing against the sector that's receiving $600 billion a year of cash subsidies and another $5.4 trillion of non-cash subsidies. And that sector at the moment, and I tweeted this today because it's such a stunning number, it's spending $103 million per day. So big oil is spending $103 million per day on new oil and gas. So it's not like we don't know what needs to be done. The formula is pretty simple. We need to cut fossil fuel subsidies. We need to stop any new gas, oil, or coal. And that's not me saying it, right? That's the IPCC and the IEA and everybody else. And we need to vastly accelerate electrification and renewables. We also, by the way, need to stop deforestation and fight the plastic pandemic. So we need to do all these things. We are doing stuff related to all these things, but we're doing it far too slowly. And in some cases, we're going backwards. So according to the IMF, fossil fuel subsidies are expected to go up, not down, next year. And they're going to get worse than the IMF predicted because of the impact of the Ukraine war and the fact that oil and gas companies took up all the talking points and are now dumping on us more oil and gas infrastructure. So it's going to get worse. Now, you then have to acknowledge that governments are not doing it fast enough. and that citizen protests are also not yet moving the needle. To me, what that means is two things. Number one, we probably need a lot more citizen protests globally, right? So Fridays for Future, which is the Greta Thunberg inspired movement, or Extinction Rebellion, or many similar groups like that, have to scale up and make a lot more peaceful noise globally. In addition, however, we need to start developing tools that allow citizens worldwide to actually take direct climate action themselves, shortcutting governments, basically, or rather going above governments, legally, of course, but still shortcutting the problem.
So what kind of a tool? Yeah, give an example of like what a tool an individual could do to really make an impact, right?
That is a very, very, very big question, Chris, because, and I've been actually working on it for something like 2 or 3 years. It's very difficult to find one today. Now, there is obviously lawsuits. So climate lawsuits is a sector that's exploding in popularity and momentum. But the law, by its very nature, is slow. And a typical household unhappy about the climate crisis isn't able to just file a lawsuit. It's not a simple thing to do. So you've got the venue of the courts in many countries, which is being accessed, I think, now more aggressively. Everywhere, from the Netherlands, where Shell, found itself with a court order to cut its emissions, which it's appealing, to Germany, where the government was told that their climate action plan was insufficient and it was thrown out, right? And then replaced in a couple of weeks, miraculously, by a far more aggressive climate action plan, which probably should have been there from the beginning in the first place, etc. So now I think the search has to be for direct tools that allow anyone to take direct climate action. And to me, direct climate action means we need to send a wall of money to renewables. We need deployment. We need to send a wall of money to fighting the plastic epidemic. And we need to send a wall of money to fight deforestation. These are kind of the three biggest levers we could get a lot of people, and I'm talking hundreds of millions of people, enthusiastic about. Now, I am, to be transparent, working on such a tool. It's not easy. I'm hoping to launch it in June, and we'll announce it then. But I would encourage everyone to think along these lines. We need a lot more imagination, not on new tech and new batteries and better solar panels or any of that stuff, because we have what we need. We need a lot more imagination on tools to allow hundreds of millions of citizens to take concerted climate action together and push these three levers that I just mentioned.
So I guess from my perspective, right, that, as an individual, it's hard, right? I mean, if of your conversation, you said, hey, you have a legal recourse. Most people don't have the economic resources to go fight someone that's got deeper pockets. So that's going to be a hard battle to win. But I go back to, and maybe it aligns more with your day job and things of that nature. If we have the economics of renewables being affordable or better, and you can get corporate and larger users, they're going to make a bigger impact faster, right? Than getting hundreds, millions, or billions of people to unite is a tall order. Getting a subset of that in corporates, because it's profitable and they're paying shareholders and saying things like that, seems like a quicker journey to make a quicker impact if you want to go quick, right? Eventually you want to have everything and get there. But if you can take a chunk and take something digestible, I would think it's starting with governments and with large corporates. And I think they're starting that, at least in some sense. And you clearly don't agree based on your expression, but I can't help but think that that's happening.
It's not that I don't agree, Chris. It's not that I don't agree. I mean, of course you're right. Yes. I mean, obviously. However, governments are on their 26 climate talks, so COP26 and soon COP27, and emissions are still rising. And corporates don't have the correct environment to actually take the kind of action that you're talking about. And I'll explain my point in a second. So yes, obviously many corporates are trying, for example, to be powered 100% by renewable energy. But it's not easy because renewable energy is not present on the ground in so many countries, right? So, but corporates we have an accounting system and an insurance system and regulators that are sending corporates in the wrong direction. And the reason they're sending corporates in the wrong directions is because corporates, emit a lot of CO2, but they're not pricing it in their P&L. And frankly, all their numbers are wrong. If they were actually looking at a P&L where they had put a price on carbon, or where the accountants forced them, or the insurance companies stopped insuring their directors if they weren't doing that, or their regulators forcing them. By the way, today nobody's forcing them. If companies computed their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, multiplied it by a carbon price, deducted that from their bottom line, the behavior would be completely different from what it is today. But when, as a corporate, you're encouraged by not being charged zero for the environmental destruction that you're causing, you are sending corporates in the wrong direction. So I agree with you, but let's acknowledge that there is a problem in financial statements.
But changing carbon prices, right? It's already, even the last COP that wasn't the most successful in my opinion, is an understatement, because but it wasn't. But the carbon prices are going up, right? We've had Lawson Steele on talking about carbon prices on and off again a couple times here, and he'll readily say, yeah, they're no impact for most companies at this point, right? It's almost window dressing for most folks. But that can be changed, right? So it seems like a less tall order to me. And energy is always complex, and it always has policy, and there's never anything easy. There's no simple answers, right? And so I know that when I say this, you may get frustrated, because if it's a path of least resistance, why not double down on that path and fix what's broken? Because that's clearly not working in your description of how there's a lever that we could use that we're not using. It seems easier to convince, hundreds of countries than billions of people.
I honestly, I'm not sure about that, because the hundreds of countries have done nothing for 40 years. Now, okay, so look, the carbon pricing issue is clear and everybody knows what to do. The literature is out there. And the question is, what levers do we have to push that type of change through? And I don't know. We'll see if something will happen in the next 2 to 3 years. But in some ways, it's much easier if we had a tool, or 2 or 3 or 5 or 100. It's much easier to mobilize 500 million people with a simple message that doesn't cost them much, right? Because you're trying to aggregate capital, basically, than it is to fight the clear facts from 26 years of climate talks.
But I think there's tools that are coming into play, right? If you believe in climate change and believe the weather's changing, we have 100-year events less than every 100-year, the insurance industry is not going to be able to put up with that. I mean, the cost, if you look at the COP conference and you say, should the wealthier countries be paying a country that's going underwater? Is there responsibility if you were an industrialized nation and we're not, now we're underwater? All these things are taking place. But I go back to the levers in my experience, and it's probably because I'm American, go back to economics, right? So when the insurance industry says, hey, I can't afford to have a hurricane blow down, billions of dollars worth of stuff at a cadence that's not every 100 years, and my actuarial tables just change where nobody could afford insurance because of what the climate's doing, people need to do that. And I don't think we're far away based on, look at the fires going on. There's another one going on right now. Johan and I are reviewing a book about the California fires that we're going to talk about. I think there's plenty of people, and I'm not a scientist, nor am I pointing to scientific fact. I'm going with kind of what I'm just seeing and feeling in the market right now, which is these events seem to be more often. I seem to be hearing a lot of talk about climate change, and there seems to be an economic impact. And at a certain point, people are going to want to tap out of that. That's what I think. And maybe it's naive, maybe it's foolish thinking, but to me, that's going to be the most powerful because business is going to be behind that when it's costing you money and you can't get insurance and when you can't get power off a grid and you need to use renewables.
Look, the US is a perfect case study. Now, remember, by the way, I'm not necessarily in disagreement with a lot of this stuff, right? But my central point is we don't have time and we're not doing well enough. But what you mentioned is the perfect case study. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Insurance companies came in the United States and said, there are certain areas that we can't insure. Do you know what happened in these areas? You had a real estate boom. Because, of course, Congress stepped in. And now there isn't actually much of a problem. And so even in US areas, coastal areas, where insurance doesn't want to insure existing and certainly not new homes, and is on the record saying so, the politics are such that the central government steps in, and boom, problem solved. We have housing booms in these areas. And this includes, several areas across the East Coast, several areas across Texas, and also areas on the West Coast. And so yes, you're right. Hypothetically, this shouldn't be happening. But there you go. This is what governments are actually doing. I mean, the Biden administration is one of the most progressive administrations on climate in the history of the United States, probably. But then look at actually what they're doing. So they went and they reversed a Trump order to develop some Arctic reserves in Alaska by cutting the percentage that could be developed by 30 points. But you can still develop something like 60% of the Arctic Reserve, just not, 90%. So do you see what I mean? The job is not getting done. We don't have time, and climate change isn't waiting for this. And what I'm reflecting to you, Chris, is the frustration, not so much of the markets, because there isn't any as far as I can tell, or the corporates, yeah, there is some, but of the average citizen worldwide. Because people are not stupid. They know that climate is happening, and they know that not much is being done about it. But they feel helpless because it's like, how am I going to fight a floating LNG terminal? It's tough. And we got to give them tools to do something about it themselves and to mobilize them in their hundreds of millions. And we're going to get there.
Johan.
But isn't it also that a fundamental challenge is that even if you want to, as a consumer or as a corporate, be that in Europe, Asia, or in the US, accessibility 24/7, reliable on renewable energy is not there, which means that there is also a transition in terms of what we discussed of increasing solar, increasing wind, and the storage part of it. And how does this then fold together with one of your previous comments and then what you also wrote today, where $104 million goes into investment in the traditional oil and gas? So is there really enough energy, enough investment for the short term, never mind the long term, but for the short term, to actually meet the need, even if we as consumers write all the blogs and jump on all the kind of bandwagons in a positive way, of course, to change this? Can we?
Yeah. Look, that's a bit of a red herring, Johan. To be frank, I'll tell you why. The issue is not that actually, right? So we can deliver reliable energy with renewable energy. But what we need is we need a lot more of it in order to do so, right? So it's a deployment issue. Meanwhile, you have existing fossil fuel assets, right, that can fill in the gaps until that deployment basically makes them redundant. But you need the deployment to make them redundant. If you sit around and you say, oh, there's nothing I can do because it's, this and that, and you don't deploy, then you're never going to solve the problem. So the kind of fundamental takeaway should be that we should not be building any new coal-fired power plants, any new gas-fired power plants, any new refineries, etc. Right? Not that we should suddenly close everything that we have, because that would be mad, right? So, nobody's going to do that, and nobody's preaching that. But unless you multiply deployment speed by 3 to 7 times, you're never going to solve the problem, because you'll always run into that argument. You'll never be able to. It's a vicious circle.
No, and I agree with you, and I think that the question was answered in a very good way, and I think that's the thing. I think it's just that as a consumer, if we go back to putting pressure as a consumer today, what are our options apart from driving the kind of the consumer lobbying? But out of curiosity, when we look at investments, my head is stuck on these 104 million daily on new investments. If we take that, I think it was a list of 10 companies that you talked about, and then you mentioned in your post. If they're spending this much on new development, how much in percentage or in part, and are they also investing in renewable? Is this the lion part of their investments for these companies? Because if it is, we're surely in a big problem.
Oh, it most certainly is. If you look at the R&D or investment budgets of the oil companies, yes, sure, they're spending a bit of money on renewables, but it's in the nature of 1 to 5% of their investment plans, right? And
95% of their communication.
Correct. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Equinor being a very good case in point. And the irony, of course, is that they then say, oh, but we want to spend a lot more, but we can't because we need to deploy, billions, and renewable energy, can't take it, which is, kind of just adding to the negative messaging around renewables. Then they'll go, oh, it's intermittent. Then they'll go, oh, it kills birds, or whatever, forgetting all the kind of harm and destruction that they're causing. And so, look, we can't count on big oil to come and save us by multiplying global deployment of renewable energy by 3 to 7 times, right? You can count on them to do what is in their interest, and that will change with time, I hope. But they're not going to come on a big white horse and save us. It's not the solution. We need to deploy far more renewable energy by the renewable energy industry and new entrants, not by big oil, right? New entrants, for example, could be the tech companies. The tech companies are doing, pretty aggressive deployment of renewable energy. People like Apple and Google and Facebook and others, right? They're now building their own plants, not only investing in other people's plants.
So I think we've gone all over the place. I think that what I hear you say is fairly aggressive, but then when I was hearing you talk to Johan, it was a little bit more like, hey, we just need to start. We need to do this fast. And I'm frustrated because it's an excuse to say we don't have all the components on the shelf to do this today. And so that's a stall tactic by some. And if the people had a voice, they could kickstart this thing. That's kind of what I've taken away from this conversation so far. I take away that, I tend to probably be a little bit more trusting in the world where we're at and thinking that there is a transition that will take place and that we're going to get there. So I I think we both agree that we want an end game of not having a dead planet. I think that anybody would be crazy to not think that. I don't know that we're going to get there as fast as you want, even with a tool. I think the reality of
it's not me who wants, Chris. It's not me who wants. Remember, this is not like my desire. It's a climate emergency at a global scale. And yes, it's hugely frustrating. And, it does make me angry that the suffering, unfortunately, is in the global south until further notice, right? Because the global north can actually get away from the problem by spending on it. And other people can't. But nonetheless, this is a global problem, and it's also in the global north, and it's just going to get worse. But it's not me saying it. This is just factual.
Right. But I would say that you're more aggressive stance than 90% of the people I talk to on a daily basis in the energy business. I mean, I'm in energy as well as you are in your day job, right? So we both are passionate. We have a podcast talking about renewable energy, and we spend a lot of time saying, hey, there's all kinds of cool things that we're going to be doing here. I don't think it's on steroids at the pace that you believe it needs to be, or that you wholeheartedly say, the empirical data tells us it needs to be at. So I'm not blind to that. I don't have my head in the sand going, oh, geez, there's no problem. There is a problem or whatever. I'm looking at the realities of what the world is doing around me, right? And what's likely to happen as you are. And that's why you want to change it. You want to create a tool. But I would say we're at a little bit different place. I think, Johan, being my Swedish friend, is probably somewhere closer to the middle than I am. But I'll let you wrap up, Johan. But that's what I've taken on the show. I think it's been a great conversation. I'm glad I've given you the forum to share your ideas. I'm not totally 100% bought in. I'm not anti. I'm somewhere in there. And you've done a good part of getting my ear, I guess, is what I would say. Johan?
No, and I agree with what you said, Chris. Being the Swede, kind of the neutral, or at least for a few more days, I guess, in between here. I think it was really interesting, and I think what we have discussed in the many shows comes to light, that there is very difficult. There's so many stakeholders. There's so many parts around this. I tend to see, you can't do one and not the other. The audience, or the public, the consumer, will drive this sooner or later, but there needs to be options for them as well. The corporates, I really thought that was kind of something that gave me a little bit of an eye opener, that the white horse, the knight on the white horse will not be the traditional energy companies that they kind of sometimes paint themselves to be. Which I thought was also quite of an interesting part. But overall, I thought it was a great discussion, and I thought the whole topic raised a lot of questions, raised a lot of energy, which means that if we can do that on a show of 3, imagine discussions around the billions of people that we need to get engaged. So really appreciate you coming on.
Assaad, you clearly wanted to give us feedback because you clearly don't buy what we said. So I'm going to give you one last chance to get your word out there, because I don't think it's fair to shut you down and just say what I think and not give you a chance. Because I heard you try to get in before Johan talked. So before we say goodbye, some final thoughts, please.
Well, I don't really have much to add to what I've already said. I mean, I'll leave you with a couple of parting thoughts. Number one, we don't have time, period, right? And then number two, climate change actually kills. It's not some foreign concept. And death from burning coal, oil, and gas alone are, 10 million a year, right? There's also planetary consequences here. And yes, we need to far more dramatically face the problem. And there is a huge urgency to it. And things are just going to have to change.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing and indulging us, in answering
pleasure.
my skepticisms and answering the questions very forthfully, politely, directly, sharing the sense of urgency. I was going to say yours, but you would argue with me that it's the world's sense of urgency because it's a climate crisis. Thank you so much for being on. I'm sure there's going to be comments. I would encourage you to read the comments of the show or check out our YouTube channel, because I would be surprised if there aren't pro and non-pro comments to today's conversation. That would be really surprising to me.
Thank you very much, both.
For our audience, you've spent another hour listening to Insider's Guide to Energy. We hope you've enjoyed the content. We try to provide all the views. We're sharing opinions from everybody. And if you do enjoy it, if you see the sense of urgency, please share the show, get people to comment on it, get in the dialogue. And don't forget to subscribe. We'll talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.